Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Glegg. I am a librarian here at the Grand Rapids Public Library up on the 4th floor in the History and Special Collections Department. And we're really thrilled that you came out on this very snowy morning to enjoy a little local history with us. I have the pleasure this morning of introducing our first speaker, Marty Thompson Arnold. Marty grew up in the 1950s in Kalamazoo, listening to her grandmother's stories about the old plank road. She attended Northwestern University and then taught in the Chicago area. While living there, she was once accused of being a Michigan chauvinist. She admits this may have been accurate, but stemmed from a serious case of homesickness. So in 1980, she convinced her husband to move to Grand Rapids, where she started researching the plank road. This work resulted in a feature article in the Grand Rapids Press's Wonderland magazine in 1982, then a presentation for the Grand Rapids Historical Society's annual meeting, and then finally more than a dozen bus tours over 2 years along the original route. Marty has worked and volunteered in various capacities. She served as a reporter for the Grand Rapids Press, then a local writer and editor, then an adjunct instructor at Aquinas College before spending 2 decades in nonprofit communications at Partners in Public Education and D.A. Blodgett St. John's. And in the 1990s, she served on the Grand Rapids Historical Commission, including a term as president. Now in retirement, Marty has published a novel, Raised in Captivity. I encourage you all to check it out. Not surprisingly, it is set in West Michigan and full of historical references to gypsum mining, fruit farming, and the preservation of a vintage urban zoo. Today, she invites us to return with her to the old plank road, that wonderful washboard that first linked Grand Rapids to the outside world. Welcome, Marty.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. I think you must be the sons and daughters of Michigan pioneers to get out of your driveways and get here. I want to thank Tim for his introduction and for being my handler throughout this whole process. He took all my old slides and converted them to digital. And for Chris Byron for inviting me. I never expected to be any kind of a detective or to rate a handler. I'm also really happy to be sponsored by the Grand Rapids Public Library. Years ago, I dumped a whole big box and a couple of grocery bags, I think, on somebody's desk in the archival department. And this was all about the plank road. And they turned it into a really elegant archival collection with my name on it. So if you Google me, just Google my name, this whole thing will come up. So they really did me proud, and I think some of you may have a box like that somewhere in your basement, and when you're done with it, I urge you to think about donating it to the library. They'll take good care of it. So here's the article that I wrote for the Wonderland magazine back in 1982. They paid me their top rate of $150 for a year of research. So you may be wondering, why would anyone do that? Although people in this room probably would understand better than most. So I want to tell you what my life was like in the early 80s. As Tim told you, I'd moved from Chicago to a new place I had never lived before. As a native of Kalamazoo, I was just a little bit disappointed that we weren't moving back to Kalamazoo. And I think my research about the plank road from Grand Rapids to Kalamazoo kind of helped me connect to my new home. Besides, I needed a grown-up project to keep my sanity. Both my mom and my grandmother were wonderful keepers of family stories and loved to pass them along. We are all descended from the Stoddards and the Goodriches from the little town of Cooper, north of Kalamazoo. Both these homes are still standing and in beautiful shape, and they were both near or on the old plank road. And stories of living there kind of got me hooked on wanting to know more. So here's a brief overview. The Kalamazoo to Grand Rapids Plank Road operated from 1855 to roughly 1870. It was 48 miles long and surfaced in wooden timbers. Maybe not all wooden timbers. There's some controversy about that and some question. It was privately owned and paid for by tolls. It generally follows what we call Old 131, starting at Division Avenue, and it cut through pretty much untamed wilderness, but soon small towns and villages sprouted up like Wayland and Plainwell. Here's a lovely impressionist painting of an unidentified plank road, probably in New York. That's where the first American plank road was, started from Syracuse. I'm not quite sure where it went, but it was 1846. And it was modeled after a similar one in Canada, built 10 years before that, which was modeled on European plank roads, particularly common in Russia. So, you might be wondering, why would anyone build a road out of wood? We need to go back several decades to the early 19th century to answer that question. At that time, settlers were trickling into Michigan. When they arrived, they found a pretty interesting network of foot trails that were used by both wildlife and Native Americans. One early settler in Kalamazoo remembered, "From the door of our log cabin, we could often see long files of Indians on foot or on ponies, wending their way along trails that were in places worn down to the depth of 2 feet. These trails, as you can see by the modern map, were the blueprint for our modern highway system. But none of this would happen for several decades. The problem was these well-used Indian trails were not very helpful if you were trying to pull a wagon with a horse or an ox. To make matters worse, this is no news, Michigan gets some pretty deep snow. We also have marshy terrain, and in drought, that doesn't help either because we have loose, sandy soil. Early surveyors stamped the words "interminable swamp" right across the middle of the mitten. That had to hurt. One early evaluation said Michigan was unsuitable for agriculture or other productive activities. So before 1850, most of the transportation and trade in Michigan was done by water. And so we were limited to trade with Canada through the Great Lakes. New England migrants just marched right past our beautiful peninsula for drier, flatter states. Things kind of came to a head, though, in 1837. That was a good news, bad year. Good news, bad news year for Michigan. On the plus side, Michigan achieved statehood. Yay for Michigan. On the other hand, the United States was hit by the Panic of 1837. In this political cartoon, a landlord stands at the door holding an eviction notice. Mother says, "My dear, cannot you contrive to get some food for the children? I don't care for myself." And Pa says, "I have no money, I cannot get work." Banks went belly up, businesses failed, unemployment rose in some places to 25%. This recession lasted 7 years. Without roads or the taxes to pay for them, Michigan was in deep trouble. Grand Rapids particularly suffered. We were just a little bit too far north to really trade with other cities. Our lifeline was the river and our steamboat traffic, but we were pretty much cut off by land. The Good Intent line of stagecoaches serviced travelers coming from Kalamazoo or Battle Creek. It traveled through Richland, which was called Gull Prairie, Prairieville, Yankee Springs, Middleville, Whitneyville, and Cascade. And in the end, all the stagecoaches could really guarantee was Good Intent. First of all, it was a long way around. Even today, by car, it takes over 2 hours to travel from Kalamazoo to Grand Rapids on that route. It's 82 miles long. And this was often the result. Michigan roads were compared to beds of brickyard mortar. All this talk about Michigan roads sound familiar? Some things never change. So you might be wondering, why didn't early Michiganders just build railroads? Well, they did. Between 1830 and 1850, a few were built, but railroads really became out of reach for a young state in deep depression, or recession, whatever. But early Michiganders were a resourceful bunch, and they'd had enough. Decided to take matters into their own hands. First, they built corduroy roads, which just meant laying logs over low-lying areas. The problem with that, though, was that the logs would roll or slip or rot and be a hazard to draft animals. Planked roads, which use smooth, hewn planks, were a great advantage. Besides, timber was plentiful and virtually free and easy to build with typical skills a farmer might have. And the people became so enamored with the idea that there was an era called plank road fever. The most fevered of them all was Ephroditus Ransom. He was a farmer and a judge from Kalamazoo. He eventually served on the Supreme Court. But as a young judge, he'd ridden the circuit on horseback and had experienced firsthand the trials of Michigan roads. In 1848, he became the 7th governor of the state, and he pushed through the Plank Road Act, which set standards for private toll roads. They authorized good, smooth, permanent roads, 16 feet wide with planks 3 inches thick, laid side by side on stringers. Stringers are those, the underlying logs or pieces of lumber that the cross pieces are nailed to. Again, these were privately owned, and they were able to charge tolls for their both construction and the maintenance. Ransom's administration chartered 200 companies who promised to build 6,000 miles of roads in Michigan. The Kalamazoo Gazette even took up the cause in 1850, writing, "Everyone knows there's a flourishing city 50 miles north of Kalamazoo, boasting splendid churches, steamboats, and enterprising businessmen. But," and I added the but, "this city is locally isolated by horrible roads. A plank road would obviate the difficulties of mud and mire and pay to the stockholders from 20 to 30% on their investment." You'll want to remember that number. Ransom was so sold on the idea that he sank almost his entire fortune into the building of the Kalamazoo to Grand Rapids Plank Road. In 1849, the Kalamazoo to Grand Rapids Plank Road Company, as it was called, was incorporated. They set about securing rights-of-way, surveying the route, and hiring contractors. They offered stock shares to investors, like this one from an Indiana plank road. Directors promised that the oak and elm timbers would last forever. You might remember that, too. In 1852, the call went out for 500 men. The Grand Rapids City Council authorized the grading of Division Avenue to the city limits at Wealthy Street. Construction went on for 4 years. So again, some things never change. In the summer of 1855, the first tolls were taken at a toll gate at Division and Wealthy. We don't have a picture of it, but we think it must be similar to this one on Robinson Road near Reed's Lake. For each mile, travelers were charged a penny for a horse, a half a penny for 20 sheep and swine, 2 pennies for 20 head of cattle. Toll gates at Division Avenue had to be moved whenever the city limits expanded because tolls were not allowed to be taken inside the city. Meanwhile, stagecoach companies seized an opportunity. This is a photo mural that some of you may remember from the old Pantlin Hotel. It was a large, someone told me that it was in the basement, but I don't know. The caption read, "This is one of the old Kalamazoo coaches, the best transportation from Grand Rapids to Kalamazoo for 13 years. If you want to go on a stagecoach, it would cost you $2.50. You would have boarded at the Eagle Hotel on Market Street, west of Monroe. And I blew up that tiny little sign there, and you can barely see it says Kalamazoo Stage Hire. From the stagecoach, on Division Avenue, there isn't really anything left today from the Plank Road era, but you would have passed John Roche's store on South Division and the home of Louis Campaux's brother Antoine, which was at today's Antoine Street. At 68th Street, you would have found this service station. Soon businesses sprouted up, and this was one of them. On the northeast corner of 68th Street, Charles Moore had a blacksmith shop, a shingle mill, a lumber yard, and a stable where tired horses could be switched out for fresh ones, and travelers could get out and stretch their legs. At first, the Plank Road was a traveler's dream. One family that benefited from the Plank Road were the Cutlers. They arrived with their 10 children from New York during the time of construction. They built this rustic farm in 1853, but were living in the one on your right by 1891. They did very well. The fortunes of the Cutlers illustrates the impact of the road on those who were lucky enough or smart enough to settle nearby. This slide shows the view from 84th Street looking south, and on the right you see Old 131. On your left is Division Avenue Court. It is the older of the two, and so we are going to do a little shunpiking. Now, shunpiking, some people tell me, is not a familiar word, but it means, in my family, it means that you get off the highway, off the pike, and you go on some side roads, because you're wanting to see fall color, or you're just enjoy the way the older, that they're picturesque. So we are going to do a little shunpiking, and you can see the way on the left, the Plank Road took a turn, which was dangerous for automobiles going 50 miles an hour. So they straightened out. So where that happens along the road, it's really interesting to shunpike and take the old road. Sandwiched between those two roads is this farm. I took this photo in 1982 because the house is now pretty much obliterated by beautiful big trees. It's hard to take a picture of it, but it's still in good shape. And was when I did my original research was a centennial farm. I don't know if the Flannery family still lives there, but the house is in beautiful shape. Another beauty is the Lane home. It was a 20-room mansion, and you sometimes can see that. Also, their trees are growing up, but you can see it from the Highway 131 at 92nd Street. According to the owner, at the time I was doing my research, it was built by James Lane in 1856 when they were able to get access to their property along the Plank Road to build the home. For his wife and 14 children, they lived in Grand Rapids permanently, but this was their summer home. And eventually, when the children grew up and moved away, the house was converted into a stage stop and hotel. And since I started doing this research 40 years ago, the house is in much better shape. It's really beautiful. Records of the inn say that Chester Arthur stayed here during his 1880 campaign for president, and Louisa May Alcott stayed here on a book tour. And there's a rumor that a Mr. Woodard, who stayed at the hotel, was really Jesse James hiding out. And some say there's a body buried under a mound in the dirt basement. I'm not going to put my stamp on any of that as being true, but they're great stories. Those interminable swamps are visible from the edge of the road, reminding us why a plank road was necessary in Michigan. A little more shunpiking at 137th Street, which is also called Calkins Corners. The plank road there took 2 sharp turns along the Rabbit River, and they straightened it out with an S-curve, which old-timers, it must have been in the 30s or 40s or whatever, old-timers called it the Mae West curve. If you laughed, you're of an age. Again, these little detours are worth slowing down for. The Calkins home on the left has a story that I'm going to save for later, but just that whole little stretch has some beautiful farms that have been there for I don't know how long, a long, long time. Not much has changed. In Plank Road days, Wayland, which is a little further on, was called Chambers Corners for Nelson and Emily Chambers, who arrived there and lived right at the downtown corner in 1836. This, at that time, was 5 miles from their nearest neighbors. They had many adventures, this couple. First of all, their farm was nicknamed Rattlesnake Farm for obvious reasons. Nelson shaved shingles and sold them in Kalamazoo and Battle Creek, so he was often gone, and Emily was alone with the children. One time his ox fell ill, and he was delayed for so long that Emily had to dig up the seed potatoes to feed the children. Another time, Nelson went to buy a neighbor's pig. When he hadn't returned by midnight, Emily set out with a torch in the direction of the sound of howling wolves. She found her husband huddled in the back with his arm around the pig and a small hatchet in the other hand to defend himself and the pig. The pack of wolves followed them all the way back to their front door. Nelson later became the proprietor of the Wayland House, which was a stagecoach stop, and it was on the site of their first cabin. Both Nelson and Emily are buried in the Wayland Cemetery, just feet from the edge of the old plank road. A toll road still exists there. It has been moved to Mill Street. I took a picture of it in '82 and then again more recently, and again you can see it's in better shape than it was 40 years ago. So this is encouraging for we who love history. 3 miles south is Bradley, where there was a large inn and stagecoach stop called the Halfway House, because we're about halfway to Kalamazoo. It was owned by a proprietor named Mary Jane Seaver. She was renowned for her culinary skills. In fact, her table was said to groan with the good things that she served, and her specialty was squirrel pie. Again, this home is in much better shape than it was 40 years ago. These stately maples near Shelbyville, which is a railroad town, not a plank road town, by the way, looks like they could have been planted next to the planks of the plank road. 6 miles south of Bradley is the little burg of Martin. It was known from the very beginning for its dense forests. You may have heard of Charles Garfield. He had a farm at Burton and Madison Southeast. He traveled with his parents when he was 8 years old to Grand Rapids in 1856. And he wrote later a memory of stopping to admire a walnut tree that was 33 feet around and 100 feet to its first limb. His father said, "Take off your hat, Charlie, to that noble tree." I think this must have made a big impression on young Charles, because he grew up to be one of Michigan's first and most visionary conservationists. And he would be a great subject for a history detective, by the way. And also, just for fun, I scoured the internet to find a picture of a tree that might have been that big, and found this giant sycamore near Adrian, but it's only 26 feet around. When a resident of Martin took this photo of his new horse, he had no idea that he was capturing the only known photo of timber planks on our own plank road. Someone mentioned that it looked like there was a crosswalk there. I wonder if stagecoaches had to stop for pedestrians. When the first stagecoaches passed this house in 1855, the house was already 17 years old. It's probably one of the oldest surviving structures visible along this whole route. And it was the first brick house in the county, and I think probably one of the first brick houses in most of West Michigan. It was such an unusual site that if you wanted to direct people, you would just say the red brick house, because there were just no others like it. So this is a vintage postcard view. Chris, you like this. It's probably a little later because it shows a large addition on the side, but also out of red brick. 40 years ago, this was still the Red Brick Inn. And one of those little babies I showed you a picture of had her first birthday when I was doing my research along the plank road at this very inn. At that time, there was a portrait of the owner, Calvin White, in the foyer. His home must have seemed like a castle to him, because his first home on his property was a hollow oak tree. He first built a log cabin and had a trading post where he traded cattle, sheep, grain, songbooks, molasses, ox carts, mutton, hats, thread, lumber, and cowbells. He also fixed shoes, mended clothing, sold soap, bedding, salt, and sugar. White always made room for overnight guests, and neighbors said he never turned a stranger from his door. James Fenimore Cooper is said to have stayed here in the 1840s while he was writing Oak Openings. And he wrote of the unpeopled forests of Michigan and the small winding reach of placid water, which was the elbow of the Kalamazoo, a beautiful little river. This is the way the red brick house looks today. Most recently, it was a Sam's joint, but it has now closed and stands empty as far as I can tell. I can't see that it was sold. So I hope maybe we could take up a collection, and I don't know. And here's that beautiful little river, the Kalamazoo River. There would have been a planked bridge going across it. I believe it lasted for about 50 years and was destroyed by an ice jam behind it at about the turn of the 20th century. At this point, you enter what was known back then as the Junction. We call it Plainwell today. Fishermen bragged of catching 100-pound sturgeon from under that bridge. Plainwell grew up around this junction. And it was a junction of two plank roads, the other one going to Allegan. In 1860, one traveler remembered Plainwell as feeling like a beehive. There were Union recruits headed south to join the fighting, and 7 coaches were often stopped at the Plainwell house, resting the horses and letting travelers get out for their dinner. Notice that the coach here says Kalamazoo. Plainwell has several well-preserved buildings from the Plank Road era. The Presbyterian Church is one on Bridge Street, and several neighboring homes. Another toll was due about a mile south at the Kalamazoo County line. This particular house was built in 1853 and used as a toll house for about 5 years. I don't know why only 5 years. Martha Gilman was the daughter of the toll keepers, and she retold some of their stories in a memoir in about 1850. 1950. She wrote, "One time some fellows were coming from Grand Rapids, all dressed up for some fun. They met another group going north. They all wore tall stovepipe hats and their Sunday clothes. When the two coaches met, nobody would get off the road. There was a big fight, and both coaches eventually rolled off. Fortunately, only the hats got crushed. They were so stubborn that in the end, they all went back in the direction where they came from." Mrs. Gilman also remembered this traveling circus going by. It's probably later in the century, but it was just too fun not to include. I have no idea what those elephants were charged as a toll. Old 131 becomes Douglas Avenue by the time it gets to Cooper, 6 miles north of Kalamazoo. Cooper is named for either James Fenimore Cooper or for his daughter who married a local judge. This lovely congregational church has been on this site since 1856, and I would imagine travelers staying at the nearby inn might have gone there on Sunday morning. The corner grocery store at D Avenue is still in operation today. It is from the Plank Road era, which is pretty amazing to me. Barney Earl was its first owner. He became sort of a hero when he landed the contract for a post office in his store. Mail delivery was a major motivator for road construction in Michigan. Stagecoaches might have left without a full load of passengers, but they never left without mail. Here we descend into the Kalamazoo Valley, and you can see by the topographical map here that it really is a valley. To follow the old route, again, we need to shun Pike, this time to the right, onto Old Douglas Avenue. And if you ever get a chance, it's worth seeing. You just don't see a road this beautiful, this close to a city. And it doesn't really show how steep this descent is. This area is also called Goodrich Hill for my great-great-grandparents, Thomas and Deborah Goodrich. They built this as their last home in 1866 because they'd already been residents of Cooper for almost 30 years. The long descent into Kalamazoo is the steepest part of the entire road. Notice, if you can see the hill on the right, how it's been graded down, so it was even steeper than this. The final leg of the journey would have taken you to North Street in Kalamazoo, down Westnedge, and onto Main Street into town. At the last turn, the stagecoach driver would take out a tin trumpet and announce the arrival of the stage and lash the horses into a gallop for a grand entrance. My great-grandmother, who was born in 1855, so was a child during the Plank Road era, believed that the horses had galloped all the way from Grand Rapids. And she told my grandmother this and insisted that this was true. And when I started doing this research, my grandmother was very elderly, but she says, "Would you please find out if that's true? It just can't be." And of course it isn't. But it's kind of neat that she always thought that was true. This picture is actually a stagecoach arriving in Niles. The Plank Road did not age gracefully, but it didn't ever really die. It just kind of petered out. Planks warped and splintered and rotted. The iron horseshoes and the metal wagon rims wore down the timbers within 3 or 4 years. Remember that promise that they would last forever? And thick new planks made the surface even more uneven, resulting in a bone-jarring, noisy ride. Wagons were said to be heard a mile away. Disabled wagons blocked traffic, and making matters worse, there were rumors that the Plank Road was coming, the railroad was coming, and that created less interest in maintaining the road. Travelers resented having to pay for a dilapidated road, And so they shunpiked. A little different than the way we think of shunpiking. The term originally meant sneaking around the back of the toll gate. And there were roads that became wider and more used than the actual plank road, because people became really resented having to pay a toll on a road that was in such bad shape. So remember that next time you go shunpiking, to see the beauty of the back roads, that the real reason for that, the other meaning of that word. And so that's your vocabulary lesson for today. Many plank roads had similar problems, but ours had a particularly unique one, and that was super heavy loads of gypsum. Soil conditioner it was a soil conditioner for Michigan's acid soil, and farmers would go up to Grand Rapids, get a big load, and go back down the plank road, and it must have been hard on the timbers. Or perhaps it was the circus elephants, I'm not sure which. But the plank road became the butt of jokes. On his arrival in Grand Rapids, someone asked Mark Twain if he'd had a pleasant journey, and he said, "The road would not have been bad if some scoundrel had not now and then dropped a plank across it." The final straw came in 1870 with the completion of the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad, which went parallel to the plank road. Remember that promise of 20 to 30% return on investment? Poor Governor Ransom, the champion of plank roads, lost his fortune in that investment. He took a federal job in Kansas, where he died about 2 years later. Of the 200 plank roads he chartered, only about a third were ever built. But there were more winners than losers. Towns and villages owe their existence to the plank road. Farmers like the Stoddards, the Goodriches, the Chambers, and the Cutlers prospered because of the plank road. But the hands down biggest winner was Grand Rapids. In 1850, Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo had about the same population. By 1870, the population of Kalamazoo had quadrupled, that's good, but Grand Rapids had grown sixfold. By 1870, Grand Rapids had eclipsed Kalamazoo to become Michigan's second largest city. So I bet you're wondering, whatever happened to all those old planks? As of 1982, these two were kept safely in a barn in Cutlerville by the descendants of Charles Moore. I hope someone is still keeping them safe. Remember this home at Calkins Corners? It was owned by the Calkins family for over a century. It was built from planks taken from the road. In 1982, the owner invited me in to see a plank repurposed as a fireplace mantle. But most of the planks were just covered up with gravel and dirt and eventually asphalt. Even today, planks are unearthed during road construction, and this photo was taken in Washington State, but a similar discovery was made at Division and Oaks in the 1920s. So I'm going to close with a really inspiring poetry reading. My other great-grandfather was Asa Harding Stoddard, also known as the farmer poet of Kalamazoo. This poem more than anything, inspired me to learn more about the plank road, and it goes like this. Did you ever, friend or stranger, let me ask you, free and frank, brave the peril, dare the danger of a journey on the plank? Ever see the wild commotion, hear the clatter, din, and clank? Feel the quick electric motion caused by riding on the plank? Wagons creaking, groaning, crashing, wrecks bestrewing either bank, jarring, jolting, jamming, dashing, this is riding on the plank. Hats and bonnets strangely rocking, leave no space between them blank. Kisses stolen, oh, what shocking things do happen on the plank. Fathers swearing, children squalling, angry mothers try to spank, seats upset and they go sprawling in a wagon on the plank. Ye with torpid liver, sickened, cold and languid, lean and lank, this will cure without a question. Take one ride upon the plank. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marty. That was fantastic. I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. Start right here.
My second great-grandpa rode on the plank road, or the stagecoach, from Kalamazoo to Grand Rapids. And according to his granddaughter, my great aunt, the end of the line was at Division and Cherry. And when they got out of the stagecoach, the driver had frozen to death.
The driver.
Did you ever run across that story in your
No.
research? Okay.
This is why my presentations keep getting longer and longer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Real curious, how wide were the planks?
16 feet wide if they followed the charter law, which they probably did.
That impressionist painting, beginning of your presentation, do we know who the artist is?
No, we don't. I find it all the time, but I never see an attribution for it, unfortunately, because it really is lovely.
The builders of the plank road, did they actually buy the property on which they built the road?
All I know is that they secured rights of way. So I suppose they probably had to pay for some of those. You know, a lot of the area didn't belong to anybody except probably the federal government or the state at that point, and the state was happy to have them do that. So it was a lot easier than it would be today.
I see the shun piking people that just wanted to avoid the tolls at the toll booths, but how did they collect toll from people that lived on the road? Or did they collect toll if you were just going down to your neighbors or hauling freight or whatever?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible that they could be charged. And I don't think if you were walking, you were charged at all. It just seems to be for horses, for serious travelers. Mm-hmm. You know, I didn't.
I'll repeat the question so people can hear.
Okay.
How long did it take to go from Grand Rapids to Kalamazoo?
I didn't say that because I'm not really sure. I have seen diaries where people came from Kalamazoo and stayed overnight in Wayland. But it, kind of depends on how many horses you have. Stagecoaches were a lot faster because they switched horses. So they always had fresh horses, and they were trying to be competitive. But if you just had your own horse and wagon or your horse, you had to stop every 10 miles or so and rest your horse. So it was still pretty long. But at least at first, you didn't get stuck in the mud as often.
All right, we'll have one final question.
Were the planks white pine?
Not that I know. I think they were oak and elm. So.
All right, let's thank Marty again.